imagine that 200, that we can have a city of 260,000 people and nobody's doing anything wrong.
Sure.
All we hope is we find, I think it'd be a terrible mistake to do anything with Lloyd.
Well, it is interesting because he is the only financial company CEO to have survived the financial crisis. You had said earlier to Becky that if Lloyd came to you, you'd say absolutely stay on. If Goldman's board came to you and said we're thinking about replacing Lloyd, you would say no, keep him.
I would disagree with him.
You would disagree with the board.
But I don't think the Goldman board has any notion of doing that. And when we put $5 billion into Goldman in September of 2008, which was not the easiest time to invest in anybody, we had been approached by the management of numerous other large financial institutions, including large investment banks, and we turned them down.
Sure.
So I think I felt the best about Goldman in terms of not only its business operation, but in its risk control, and they did do the best job of risk control during that period.
Some observers, Mr. Buffett, might compare this to your investment in Salomon in 1987 when you took a 12% stake. Is that fair? Because that certainly is going around the trading floors. There are comparisons, Goldman's chart versus Salomon's chart during the crisis it faced in 91.
Well, in the case of Salomon, there was no question. When I got called back there in August of 1991, there was no question something very wrong had been done. But it had only been done by a bond trader, and then the top management did not report promptly at all the transgressions of this particular trader. And the real problem with Salomon was to essentially take away the stain that was on 8,000 people and place it properly on the stain of a bond trader that had broken a bunch of government rules. But we knew exactly when we found out exactly what he'd done. He clearly had broken the rules, and we went down and presented all the evidence to the proper authorities, and we got rid of the guy, and he went to jail for a short period of time.
Hey, Warren.
So that's a different case than this.
Yeah. Warren, the FT seems to think that Goldman at this point is making some moves to overhaul some of its practices as a precursor to a possible settlement. Do you think the SEC would like to settle? Would you, when you talk to Blankfein, has he asked you, do you think a settlement is the right move to make? Do you think it is?
Well, sometimes it gets into a business decision regardless of how you feel about the merits of a case. But I've not talked to Lloyd about a settlement whatsoever. The SEC... historically, I think they'd like to settle most things rather than try them. But generally, the judicial system, the judges like you to settle rather than go to trial. So who knows how it'll play out? But I do not see anything in the Abacus transaction, and I've looked at it. I do not see anything in the Abacus transaction that would cause me to want to settle simply on the legal aspects of it. If it becomes a business decision, that's something for the board of directors of Goldman Sachs to figure out.
Warren, over the weekend, you said that if you had to bet your life on either higher inflation or lower inflation, you'd take higher inflation and potentially much higher.
Yeah, we are following policies which will lead to inflation accelerating. I mean, there's no question about that. The question is whether we will change those policies before, you've lit this fuse. Basically, it's a long fuse, and you can change policies and therefore blow out this fuse that's going toward the dynamite. But if you don't, the dynamite it'll get to the dynamite eventually. And countries that borrow larger and larger amounts of money in relation to their output in their own currency, pretty soon, at some point, decide that they don't want to pay it back with currency of the same purchasing powers. And the problem about inflation is it creates its own dynamic once it gets going. And we had that in the late 70s, and it took Paul Volcker, and a meat axe to stop it. And he was probably the most unpopular man in the United States for a period of time. But we got to 15% or so interest rates for governments and a 21% prime rate. And if Volcker hadn't come along, who knows what would have happened. So you don't want to play around with inflationary dangers.
But you were very much in support of the government taking the actions it did to stop and stem the financial crisis when it occurred. What have they done that you think has been too much, or have they done anything?
No, I think they went all in, and the American public needed to see they were going to go all in. When the whole world wants to deleverage, the only party that can leverage up is the government, and the United States government did something perfectly proper. Whether they did it perfectly, nobody knows. But what became clear in the fall of 2008 is that the chairman of the Fed and the Secretary of the Treasury and Sheila Barrett at FDIC were willing to do extraordinary things to essentially prevent a panic. And they were the only ones that could have done it, and I cheer them mightily for that. Now, that was the medicine that was applied to a cardiac attack. Now we got to deal with the after effects of the medicine. And we had unprecedented amounts of medicine, so we may have some unprecedented difficulties in weaning ourselves away from the problems that result from that medicine.
Jim Owens is the CEO of Caterpillar. He has an op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal where he lays out some of the things he thinks needs to happen to make sure that America gets back on the right path. One of those is making sure we have a very strong and independent Federal Reserve. Another is that American companies should only be paying taxes on their American profits that they're kicking out, and that would mean companies that have international operations could bring more back to the United States. Do you think that is a good theory?
Well, the second part of it. If you talk about reducing taxes on corporations, which is what that is, we have a huge gap between taxes and expenditures, and somehow that has to be narrowed, and it probably won't be narrowed by tax cuts. So I respect him enormously, and I know what he's talking about, but in the end, we are taxing 15%, not much more than 15% of GDP, and we're spending 25% of GDP. That is not sustainable, and the idea of cutting taxes on anyone or any entities from this level, I think that would be sending the wrong message about what we regard as the sanctity of our currency over time. If I were a bondholder of the United States and I saw that we were widening the gap by cutting taxes, that would bother me a great deal.
I would say most people in this country realize taxes are going higher, but the debate is how much higher and who exactly is paying those share of the taxes. Is there a point where you get worried if taxes are raised to a certain level, whether that be against American corporations, whether that be taxes that are levied against the wealthiest Americans? Is there a point where you think that there is a tipping point?
Well, we have to eventually get the gap between expenditures and receipts down to maybe 2% of GDP. We can handle 2% of GDP, and growth takes care of that over time, or 3% perhaps. But you can't have 10 or 12%. And taxes, everybody's going to scream. And if you cut expenditures, everybody's going to scream. And the question is whether Congress will have the will to do what needs to be done. And it won't be easy. I mean, Russell Long said it, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree, and that's the way we all feel. But over time, we've been pretty responsible in this country. Since World War II, we came out with 120% debt to GDP, and we brought that down into the 30s. I mean, we were willing to keep our expenditures under control and tax, and we did exactly what was proper in the last 2 years, a year and a half. We had to stem the panic. We had to restart the engine of America, and we did. And now we've got to figure out what we do next.
Well, you mentioned two things, though, also bringing down expenditures. And since that time, there have been a lot of new proposals that have either been put on the table or have actually passed and been put into action. Are those new expenditures going to get in the way of being fiscally responsible?
Sure. It's easy to promise, and you can promise away the entire GDP, but your promises don't grow more corn or turn out more automobiles. And in the end, somehow, like a family, like any kind of organization, you have to figure out a way so that your expenditures are in reasonable balance with your income. And like I say, you can run a couple percent of GDP, but we have gone through a war of sorts, just like when we went through World War II. We ran up the debt enormously in World War II. Enormously. But we then followed the proper procedures after World War II to get it back in line with where it should be. We have to do the same thing after this economic war.
Do you think we're on the right track?
Well, I think it's just now is about the time to get started. I'd probably let the recovery go a little further. And I'd want to be sure that we were gaining strength, and I would want the American public to feel we were gaining strength. You need that to get the popular will for it. But but it's something that has to be addressed soon.
We are watching what happens when it's not addressed play out right now in Greece. There was an agreement over the weekend